Hey friends, welcome. Today we're doing a simple tutorial on colorful clouds. This will be using mostly the wet on wet technique in multiple layers, and you just need a big brush. I'll be using my silver black velvet 3/4 inch oval wash brush for the entire painting. You don't have to use this exact brush. Any large brush will work great. A round brush, a flat brush, whatever you prefer. Have a water jar and a rag for blotting on hand, and your normal set of paint colors. You don't have to use the exact paints I'm using either, but I will include a list in the description below of all the colors I'm using for this particular painting. The nice thing about painting clouds is that you don't have to do any sketching beforehand, and if you want to add a little silhouette in the front at the very end, that's a great idea. My paper today is Arches 140-pound cotton cold pressed watercolor paper. This is a 7.9 inch square block, and I just love these square blocks. They're such a fun and unique size to work on, and I'm working from a reference photo on my phone. My twin sister snapped this photo, so all the credit goes to Anna Rose Bain. Thank you for the photo. A couple of optional supplies you might want to have are a spray bottle and a heat tool. This helps speed up the drying process in between layers. Make sure you're ready to go. Let's get started. We're going to begin with clear water. I'm going to spray it all over my paper. And then I like to grab my brush and just use that to evenly spread the water across the surface of the paper. The nice thing about working on a block is that the sides are glued down, so you're not going to experience the same warping and buckling of just a single sheet of paper. And also, when you're painting clouds, you don't have to worry about being exact or perfect with your shapes. Just paint pleasing shapes and colors that you enjoy. You can see the surface is glossy, wet, not too dry, not too wet. There's no puddles. You want something kind of in the middle. And if you live in a dry environment like I do, one more swipe of water might help just for good measure because it dries really fast. All right, the first color I'm going to reach for is Hansa Yellow Light. I'm going to have a light spot right here. That's where I want my sun to be. We can't see the sun. It's already sunk behind the foreground, but that's going to be the lightest patch or area in the whole painting. So I'm leaving a little sliver of white of the paper there, and then just covering some pale yellow across the bottom. While it's still wet, I rinse and remove that paint, and now I'm going to reach for my Winsor & Newton transparent orange. If you have pyrrole orange or any kind of orange, honestly, that'll work just great. And I want a creamy, fairly thick consistency of paint on my brush for this, especially since I've already wet the surface. I don't necessarily want to introduce more water onto my paper. I just need enough so that it will go smoothly across the surface. And I don't want my brush to be too dry so that it soaks up the water either. Switching back to some yellow and just sweeping that in between the orange. Color variety is so important when you're painting a beautiful, colorful sunset. We definitely don't want boring, right? So yeah, so far we've still got a nice glossy surface to work with. It is important when you're doing wet on wet to work fast because your paper will dry faster than you think. Next, I'm grabbing a warm red. This is Scarlet Lake by Holbein. And I'm going to start painting this in really quickly and in the most saturated version that I can. I want it to be super vibrant. So that means I'm scooping regularly from my palette over here, just directly right out of the palette, not worrying about mixing it around on the palette ahead of time. And I don't want to add any extra water in there. Not yet anyway. You can see how the edge is softening out beautifully. That's what the wet and wet technique does. When you pre-wet your paper, it gives the paint a chance to spread out into that wet paper, stretching the pigment all across the page. Now I'm missing some little areas here on purpose. I want to actually drop in some blues in there. And if I just cover it all with red, I'm just going to get a solid purple. And I don't want that necessarily all over. Red is definitely the dominant color in the sunset, but I want to make sure there's color variety, like I said. Now I'm going to rinse out the red really fast and switch to ultramarine blue. Again, I want a creamy consistency of paint on my brush. Nice and thick and dark. If I have too much water in there, it's just going to push aside the paint on the surface of the paper. It's also going to cause backwash or cauliflower effect, which isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it looks kind of nice. But right here, right now, I don't necessarily want that. So, okay, notice how I'm just painting right up to the red. Not quite into it just yet. We'll have a chance to blend in a second. And I'm changing the shape somewhat from my reference photo. It's not exactly like the photo. Remember, this is your painting. You can adjust the shapes however you want. I also want some of this blue here at the bottom. In the reference, I do see a streak of dark blue cloud right here. I think that looks cool, so I'm going to drop that in. Again, working quickly before my paper dries all the way out. Now, this is my chance to do a little bit of layering. I'm going to take quinacridone rose, mix it with that blue. While it's still wet enough, I can start to drop in this purple. When you mix quinacridone rose and ultramarine, you get a gorgeous royal purple. And it's a prettier purple than if I mix the Scarlet Lake and ultramarine. Believe it or not all reds and blues mix the same way. Because Scarlet Lake it leans a little more orange, which means it has a little more yellow in it. It's not going to mix as pretty with the blue. So quinacridone rose is my go-to to mix with ultramarine when I want a gorgeous royal purple. Notice how I'm just kind of lightly feathering the paint across. I'm not pressing too hard. The amount of pressure you apply to the brush really makes a big difference. And see how I combined that over the top of the red and it creates almost more of a brownish purple? That's not a bad thing, as long as you know what to expect, because I want to neutralize this red a little bit over on this side, make it not quite as vibrant. Now this space right here is rather drab. It's just one big red shape. So now I want to drop in some of that purple. You can tell that my paper is beginning to dry a little bit because the paint's not softening out quite as much as it was at the beginning. So now is when you start to watch and observe, is your paper reaching the so-called danger zone where it's starting to look matte dry, but it's still a little damp actually? That's what I call the danger zone, because if you start to drop in too wet of paint into that, you're going to get some backwash. What happens is if your brush is more wet than the surface of the paper, it's going to push aside the paint that's already starting to dry and create backwash. And I'm almost there. I think I've kind of reached that, especially on this side. I can tell it's not glossy anymore. So this is where I need to put my brush down, let this dry completely, and then we'll do the next layer. All right, I'm going to use my heat tool to speed it up. Test with the back of your hand the paper to see if it still feels cool. That means there's still some moisture in the paper and it's not completely dry. Mine is 100% dry, so I am ready for the second layer. So I'm going to take my spray bottle again and spray the whole thing. I know this can feel scary, like you're going to mess up your painting, but working in layers really does work. Once the paper's dry completely, it soaks in and you have an opportunity to go all again. That's the best thing about it. You can just work many layers over. And especially if you're working with paints that are somewhat staining, they'll definitely stay put. I don't recommend that you scrub at this point when you're applying a second layer of water, because you could lift some of the color, but you can see how it re-wet really nicely. Everything smooths out and now it's ready for a second layer of paint. I want my clouds to look a little bit more frothy and more like cotton puffballs. Right now it just kind of looks like a few red fingers and this corner's too light. So we're going to darken that up with a second layer. I'm going to take some more ultramarine and this time mix in a little bit of indigo for extra dark blue. And to create sort of a vignette effect in the corners, I'm going to drop that in. Notice how I'm just kind of dabbing. I'm not worrying about swiping in the most, I guess, studious sense of the word with my brush. Not doing any kind of intricate brush strokes. It's all very blobby. That's the fun with clouds. You can be blobby. And this is your chance to reshape some of those poofy shapes and make them how you want them to look. Now I'm going to take quinacridone rose. Still a little blue in my brush, so it's kind of a purplish color. And I'm going to begin to carve out almost these shadows surrounding the red clouds. The reds are the light values up here in the sky, and the blues are my dark values, my purples are my dark values. Maybe a little bit more red up here, hinting at a red cloud beginning to fade away. So now, especially in this section of the clouds, I'm going to drop in even more bright, bright red and really enhance and boost that color. And now I can use the tip of this cat's tongue brush to start to carve out circular shapes almost. Remember, I want to suggest puffiness to the clouds. And if I need to restore a little of that light, I can always gently lift some color back out and put in some more vibrant reds wherever I feel like I lost some of that. Scarlet Lake and any of these warm reds tend to be very quickly compromised by other colors, especially if those colors don't mix well with it. Scarlet Lake mixes great with yellows and oranges, but not so much with ultramarine. So you'll get that kind of a brownish purple if you mix the two. So if you find that you're ending up with some browns on your page, while this is still wet, you can gently lift that out and restore the red with some pure paint from your palette. I think there's this misconception that watercolors are impossible to fix, and that's just not true. Especially when you're working wet like this, there's a lot of leeway and a lot of room to push and pull the paint and make shapes how you want them to look. And already you can see that looks a lot more cloud-like in the nature of these clouds. Take a little of the blue from the palette, create a darker shadow right here. Being a little more choosy about where I put these dark shapes now that we're really slowing down. And I think this will probably be my final layer in the clouds. So that's why I'm slowing down and taking my time and really putting in some dark shapes, creating these puffy circular edges, more like cotton swabs lit up by the sun. Yeah, it's already starting to look a lot more like clouds, and I'm getting excited. I can't wait to add a silhouette at the bottom. If you're not sure what kind of silhouettes you want to make, you might decide to draw those ahead of time on a separate piece of paper. Test it out first and see what kind of design you want. It is always a good idea to plan your design before you just jump in. Now here at the bottom, I'm just going to do some dark color so I can start to see for myself what it's going to look like with a silhouetted foreground. Honestly, this is just a conglomerate of the colors on my palette, purple mostly. Yeah, so now we can start to see what that's going to look like with a foreground. Remember to check the wetness and dryness level of your paper. If it's still glossy like mine is, you can get away with some more color dropping that in. I want more purple up here and maybe even a little more indigo. Ooh, I think that's too dry though. I better leave that alone. Yes, so as soon as that glossy sheen is gone, that's it for that layer. It's time to move on. Let it dry. Come back to it if there's more you want to add. I'm going to add one shadow under this little red spot right here, giving it a bit more dimension. And now I think it's time to set it down. Once again, let's let it dry, and then we can do our silhouette at the end. All right, before we do the silhouette, there's one more thing I want to add, wet and dry, and that is just a couple of little orange streaks right here, just above our brightest bright. So I'm going to take a little bit of transparent orange, and it's okay to use the same big brush. And I'm just going to carefully paint some more distinctive horizontal lines with maybe some of the yellow shining through in between. I think it's a good idea even when you're doing blobby clouds and sunsets, to have some areas of more hard-edged distinction, which is what our silhouette's going to do. But even within the sky, I think that looks really nice. Maybe we'll take a little bit of the purple, Drop that in for one dark streak inside of this cloud. Careful not to have too much water in your brush, and if you do, that's what this is for. Constantly drying my brush on that. You can also rinse and dry your brush and then soften some of those edges if you just feel like they're a little too hard. So we still have an interesting combination then of hard edges and soft edges. All right, now for our finishing detail, the silhouette. I think I'm going to make it mostly tree line and maybe one little mountain. We'll just have to see what it does. I'm using indigo and I'm mixing in burnt sienna to help neutralize that and make more of a true black. Okay, so taking that creamy, thick mixture, and now I want to make sure I don't have like one tree or one mountain peak right in the center. That would not be a great design. But I'm going to begin over here, kind of cover up this fuzzy edge that was formed with the wet and wet, and create a mountain off to the left. And it looks like it touched a little wet spot there, so I might need to catch that before it seeps any further. Or I'll have to make my mountain taller to fix that, but that's okay. Now quickly, I'm going to resolve that edge by filling in the rest with paint here. And then over here, I want to have some tall trees coming up. So already just having this foreground here is kind of helping create some context for the sunset and make it feel like it's grounded and real, actually exists somewhere in space and time. So for my big tree, I'm going to start with a vertical line and then just quickly do this kind of side to side swiping motion with the brush, leaving a little bit of the texture of the paper showing like that. And I'm going to put another one, shorter one, right next to it. You can see it doesn't have to be perfect. You can maybe put some more distant ones over here or suggestions of them. Yeah, and I think that's pretty much all it needs. So I'm going to dry this really quick so I can fix my mountain. And we'll just ever so slightly reshape the tip of that mountain. There we go. And that's it. There's our finished wet on wet sunset landscape.